He didn't shout it. He didn't need to. With one calculated sentence, spoken into a microphone he was handed, not earned, Barron Trump questioned the place of one of the most resilient women in American politics. "She doesn't belong in Congress," he said calmly, almost carelessly. And in that moment, he wasn't just challenging Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. He was challenging every woman who's ever been told she was too young, too brown, too bold, too real. But AOC didn't clap back. She didn't post a thread. She didn't give him what he wanted. What she did instead rewrote the meaning of strength in silence. And when the dust settled, what remained wasn't outrage. It was something heavier: respect. This is the story of how one reckless comment collided with a lifetime of work. A story not about takedowns, but about receipts. About what happens when dignity becomes the sharpest response of all. This is a dramatization. Names are real, events imagined. But the emotions are deeply true. Because whether you've ever been doubted, dismissed, or told you don't belong, what follows isn't just a story, it's a mirror. So don't blink, don't scroll. Because what happens next will make you rethink what qualified really means. It wasn't the kind of panel that made headlines. It wasn't even the kind that made it to the front page of the campus newsletter. Tucked away in a dim side hall of Georgetown's political science building, the student roundtable on Gen Z and the future of public leadership unfolded like a polite group project. Well-meaning, underattended, and largely uninspired. The room held maybe 50 chairs. A third were empty. A fourth were filled with students, half scrolling, half listening. A faculty advisor dozed lightly in the back, head bobbing to some forgotten rhythm of tenure. And then something happened. He entered without ceremony. No announcement, no entourage, no pause for photos. Barron Trump, 6 foot something and still growing into the shadow of his last name, walked in like a late transfer student who didn't need directions. Words spread quickly, like static across fabric. Heads turned, eyes narrowed. Was that really him? Some students sat up straighter, as if proximity alone might matter. Others smirked, amused by the novelty of it all. The son of the storm dropped into a sleepy campus panel. A few phones came out, not in frenzy, more like instinct. And when the mic was passed his way, the room didn't breathe. The moderator, Dr. Leona Price, a tenured expert in youth civic identity, thought she'd close the session with a dash of provocation. Something candid, something students could debate over iced coffees afterward. "One last question," she smiled, polite but probing. "If you had to name one person in Congress today who doesn't belong there, who would it be?" The silence was immediate, not fearful, just taut. Everyone assumed Barron would dodge. Say something vague, default to humor, something safe. But Barron Trump leaned forward, slowly, deliberately, hands steepled like his father's, voice calm, and with the poise of someone who had never once needed to ask permission to speak, he delivered the sentence. "Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez," he said. "I think she's where she is because she photographs well. I don't think there's depth behind the aesthetic." No gasp, no boo, no rebuttal. Just impactful, unbearable stillness. Not because it was shocking, but because it was familiar. A girl 2 rows back, Latina, poli-sci major, wearing a pin that read, "Daughter of Housekeepers, Defender of Dreams," froze, not in rage, in recognition. A black grad student beside her muttered under his breath, "Again?" Even the moderator blinked, once, slowly, like her glasses had just fogged over. And then came the moment no one noticed yet. Row 3, seat 6. The quiet one in a green hoodie hit record. The panel ended. Barron stood. He didn't clarify, apologize, or smirk. Just walked out as if he hadn't said anything at all. The applause was faint, uncertain. A few claps, too late and too light, echoing in a room suddenly too cold. But outside that room, something was waking. The clip was 12 seconds. No music, no filter, no spin. Just a single sentence and a moment of silence so thick you could almost feel the heat rise from the floor. By nightfall, the video had crossed 10,000 views. By morning, it had crossed a line no algorithm could rewind, because that sentence didn't just land. It settled. It stung. And most of all, it said out loud what too many had whispered for far too long. But what Barron Trump didn't know was this. AOC doesn't fight fire with fire. She fights with presence, with patience, with proof. And in the days to come, the world would see exactly what that looked like. Up close, unshaken, and unforgettable. It started with a question. Just 7 words typed without a filter and posted from a dorm room that still smelled like instant ramen and laundry detergent. Did Barron Trump just say AOC is all style? No substance? No hashtags, no emojis. Just a 12-second clip and a caption that felt more like a dare than a summary. The student who posted it didn't expect much. She had 217 followers, mostly friends. A few bots. Her notifications were usually quiet. That night they howled. Within an hour, 3,000 views. By midnight, 50,000. By sunrise, trending on TikTok, X, and group chats and congressional staff rooms. Because the internet doesn't sleep when class and power collide, the comment section split like a live wire. He's brave enough to say what everyone's thinking. Finally, she got elected off Instagram likes. Tell me I'm wrong. A boy born into money is calling a Bronx-raised bartender unqualified? That's rich. Imagine inheriting power and still feeling threatened by a woman who built hers from scratch. But what unsettled people most wasn't the clip. It was what followed it. Nothing. No tweet from AOC, no late-night quote tweet, no clever thread, no camera-ready comeback with sharp lighting and sharper lines. Just silence. Not even her digital team posted a single frame. It didn't feel like absence. It felt like strategy. And that made people lean in. Because in a culture where every public figure fights to win the next hour, AOC didn't play the hour. She played the long arc. The silence grew teeth. Commentators noticed. Is she ignoring it? Is she waiting for him to spiral? Is she about to bury him with receipts? Theories bloomed. Speculation flooded. Memes collided. And while the internet argued over whether AOC was being too soft, too proud, too patient, she was doing none of those things. She was preparing, not for war, but for clarity. Because silence, when wielded by someone who understands power, becomes its own kind of sound. A roar inverted. And somewhere between the trending hashtags and campus blogs, people began looking at the clip again. Not at Barron's words this time, but at his face when he said them. The stillness, the certainty, the belief that style cancels substance. And beneath that, a deeper question began to bubble. Why do certain people still need to shrink women into their image of legitimacy? Why does confidence in a man read as competence, while confidence in a woman reads as cosmetic? Why does a young Latina congresswoman still have to prove she belongs, when she's already been elected, re-elected, and reshaped the national conversation? These weren't questions the algorithm could answer, but they were questions that made people pause. The silence was working, not as a tactic, but as a mirror. And in that mirror, millions began to see themselves, not in her reply, but in her refusal. Refusal to rush, refusal to stoop, refusal to let someone else's fragility hijack her dignity. This wasn't going to be a Twitter war. This was going to be a lesson. And Barron? He had no idea he'd just become the unpaid opening act. Because what AOC was about to do wouldn't just clap back. It would redefine what it means to belong. The clip had done its job. It had cracked open the national conversation like an overripe fruit. By breakfast, the narrative split screens were already live. Fox News flashed bold red banners. Finally, someone said it. Barron Trump exposes AOC's hollow brand. A roundtable of regulars nodded in rhythm, praising the clarity of youth, the courage to puncture what they called the aesthetic left industrial complex. There was laughter, even applause. One panelist joked, "If he's this sharp at 19, maybe we've got another Trump to run in 2040. Across the dial, MSNBC countered, not with volume, but with framing. Their chyron read, Silence as a strategy. Is AOC letting her work speak louder than words? The tone was quieter, reflective. A political analyst in glasses noted, sometimes silence isn't surrender. Sometimes it's a refusal to dignify an unserious provocation. Another added, her choice not to engage? That's messaging without message. It forces people to look at what she does, not just what she tweets. And people did look, but not at a podium, not on social media. They looked at a blurry phone picture posted at 7:38 a.m. by a mother of three in the Bronx. The caption read, "While they talk about her, she talks to us." The image was simple. No press, no microphone, no perfectly timed lighting, just Alexandria, coat unbuttoned, hair pulled back, leaning in over a scratched community center table, listening to a grandmother explain why the food stamps didn't last the month. Behind her, a paper chart on the wall listed the 5 most requested pantry items: rice, beans, diapers, feminine hygiene products, canned tuna. This was where she chose to be that morning, not defending herself on TV, not subtweeting, just showing up, with both ears open. And in that small act, something subtle began to shift in the national pulse. Because while one side tried to reduce her to angles and filters, she was making eye contact with people who couldn't afford either. The picture spread fast, not because it was dramatic, but because it was undeniable. No PR filter, no choreography, just presence. And presence, when rare, becomes power. The comment sections below the post hummed with something different than outrage. Something warmer, sharper. This is what real representation looks like. She's in rooms they'll never show on the evening news. He talks aesthetics. She stocks food banks. She didn't clap back. She leaned forward. For the first time since the clip dropped, the spotlight stopped swinging like a pendulum. It paused, and the country tilted its head. Not in blind worship, not in outrage either, but in something far more enduring. Attention. Real attention. The kind that doesn't demand a punchline or a flame war to stick. The kind that lingers when the trending tab moves on. The kind that starts to ask, who really belongs in leadership? Because if belonging is measured in cameras and quips, maybe Barron was right. But if it's measured in how many people you listen to when no one's watching, in how many hours you spend not proving your value, but living it, then suddenly the question wasn't whether AOC was qualified, it was why she still had to prove it. And that quiet question, that ache just beneath the noise, would become the very thing that turned a clip into a reckoning. The silence hadn't broken, but the voices had begun. Not from Capitol Hill, not from pundits or press rooms, but from street corners, chalk-lined classrooms, corner delis, and the backs of church bulletins. A ripple of stories, shared in Facebook posts with grainy profile pictures and imperfect grammar. They weren't polished, they weren't coordinated, and that made them feel even more true. I remember her showing up to our school board meeting when we thought no one would. They said the after-school program had no funding. She didn't just speak, she stayed after, helped us draft a letter to the city. We got the money 2 months later. My students got their chess club back. That was posted by a teacher in Woodside. 6 likes, no hashtags. But it started something. Then came a video from a bakery owner in Jackson Heights. A middle-aged Dominican man, hair graying at the temples, apron dusted in flour. No script, just emotion. During COVID, we were drowning. Everyone said small business mattered, but no one showed up, except her. She came through with a clipboard and questions, not cameras. She asked what we needed. I told her, rent relief, not just headlines. A week later, I got a call from her staff. 2 weeks after that, the city paused my back payments. That's not optics, that's follow-through. People started posting, not viral takedowns, but small truths, daily truths. The kind no headline ever carried. A janitor at City Hall posted a single sentence. She never looked down on me when she walked past. That's leadership. It didn't get picked up by news outlets, but it got screenshotted, shared, passed along in threads where people weren't debating qualifications. They were remembering character, and character doesn't always speak in policy. Sometimes it just looks you in the eye and calls you by your name. These weren't defenders. They weren't volunteers. They were people who had once been invisible and had, in some small moment, been seen. And slowly, across timelines and neighborhood message boards, a fuller picture of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez began to emerge. Not the curated congressional clips or fiery House floor speeches, but the one who showed up when no one asked her to, when there were no mics, no lighting, just need. And that was the irony Barron's comment never anticipated. In reducing her to an image, he had unintentionally reactivated the impact behind it, because she didn't have to say anything. They said it for her. One woman posted a photo from 2018, a younger AOC holding her infant son outside a community center. The caption read, "She wasn't even elected yet. She still took the time to hold him so I could fill out my WIC forms in peace." I'll never forget that. Another shared a blurry video of a local housing town hall. The comment read, "She showed up with a notebook, not a camera crew. Asked questions, took notes, didn't promise the moon, just promised she'd come back." And she did. The stories weren't dramatic, but together they formed a counterweight, a quiet avalanche. And unlike the viral clip, these moments couldn't be undone by a tweet, because long before anyone debated whether she belonged, she had already arrived. Not through approval, not through legacy, but through the trust of the people who never make it into sound bites. And in a world obsessed with loud moments, her quiet record began speaking louder than any headline. The clip had sparked a fire, but these stories, they built the foundation for something Barron, and maybe the nation, wasn't ready for. Accountability without applause, power without posing, and a woman whose substance never needed permission to stand. The clip hadn't just stirred the internet, it had awakened the archives. By the third day, something unusual happened. The silence from AOC still held, but others began speaking with something sharper than opinions. Receipts. Not the petty kind, not the gotchas. The kind that build legacies. A young policy analyst on TikTok posted the first thread, a side-by-side split screen. On the left, a clip from a C-SPAN hearing, 5 years old, barely circulated. AOC, calm, composed, eyes locked, pressing a Wall Street CEO on missing pension funds. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't interrupt. She dismantled with detail, not fury. On the right, footage of Barron Trump at a private golf course in Scotland, half laughing, swinging a club into the breeze. The caption was simple. One inherited a microphone, the other earned hers. It exploded. More followed. An activist reposted footage from 2019, AOC, standing at the gates of a detention facility in Texas. No sound, no speech. Just her, hands clenched on the chain link, eyes brimming. The clip hadn't been in wide circulation. It hadn't been designed for virality. She had gone down there off the clock, alone. No news crew, no Instagram filter, just grief, witnessed and absorbed. The activist added, "Say what you want about optics, but this woman cried for children no one saw. That's not staged. That's moral clarity." People started calling it the quiet record, a phrase that spread across corners of the web, usually too jaded to care. They dug up transcripts, committee questions, community events never live-streamed. A mother from Queens posted, "She came to our library and asked the kids what books they wanted. They said graphic novels. A month later, the shelf had tripled. It was all small by design, but the accumulation made it seismic, and it hit differently because it wasn't reactive. It didn't scream, 'Look at me.' It whispered, 'Here's what you missed.'" Even her critics began shifting their tone, from dismissive to nervous, because when someone doesn't need to clap back, it makes people wonder, what's she building in that silence? Then came the receipts from the floor. TikTok creators started threading together her speeches, not the viral firebrand moments, but the steady, methodical dissections of tax loopholes, of environmental oversight, of labor rights. The way she used her 5 minutes not to perform, but to push policy into public light. It was like watching someone use oxygen wisely in a room full of noise. Suddenly, people began asking, why did we ever think she had something to prove? Because when you see a woman go line by line through federal budgets, while being called unqualified by someone whose resume ends at inheritance. The contrast doesn't just sting, it illuminates. And that illumination wasn't confined to political corners anymore. High school civics teachers began resharing clips with the hashtag This Is Leadership. A nonprofit posted, "She helped us secure grant funding for East Harlem cleanup without once asking for a photo op. That's not charisma, that's commitment." The receipts weren't new, they had just gone unnoticed, until someone tried to erase the ink. And that's when people started looking at AOC's silence not as retreat, but as confidence. Because when you've built something real, you don't argue with opinion. You point quietly to your record. And if that wasn't power, then maybe people needed to rethink what power looked like. She didn't refute Barron. She didn't need to. Her record spoke. Her receipts walked. And the nation, for the first time in days, stopped scrolling and started listening. By the end of the week, the conversation had reached a strange pitch. It wasn't loud anymore. It was dense. The kind of tension that didn't scream but settled, thick in the feed. The clip of Barron's comment had now crossed 10 million views. Major networks couldn't ignore it. CNN broke the pattern with a quiet headline on a cold Saturday morning. AOC, the power of no response. It was more than clickbait. It was observation. Because in a political culture addicted to outrage, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez had chosen something radical: stillness. There were no press statements, no interviews, no rebuttal op-eds, not even a retweet from her team. And the absence became the headline. On air, anchors stumbled to interpret it. Some called it tactical restraint. Others called it weakness, disguised as grace. But the loudest voices, ironically, weren't from pundits. They were from ordinary people. A retired Marine from Michigan posted on Facebook, "I didn't vote for her. I probably never will. But that woman's got something I haven't seen in years. Dignity. Reminds me of how leaders used to carry themselves." It wasn't a viral post, but it resonated. Shared slowly, quietly, like a note passed in a crowded room. A high school civics teacher in Arizona added her own caption under the CNN article. They say silence is complicity, but sometimes silence is clarity. And that idea began to spread. Because while other politicians would have scrambled to set the record straight, AOC didn't flinch. And that unnerved people more than any fiery clapback would have. Even late-night hosts began to comment on it, not with mockery, but with intrigue. "She's either got a long game," one joked, "or she's playing a game we don't even see." The conversation began to shift. What had started as a dig at her qualifications had begun to reveal something else entirely. How does a woman who's constantly under attack stay so centered? The answer wasn't in the headlines. It was in the absence of them. Because she wasn't trying to win a news cycle. She was living beyond it. On Reddit, a thread titled, "AOC's silence is louder than Barron's words," climbed steadily to the front page. One user wrote, "This wasn't about her not knowing what to say. It was about knowing what not to dignify." The thread was upvoted over 80,000 times. Elsewhere, young organizers began quoting her old speeches, not to defend her, but to remind each other. "We know who she is. We don't need proof. We've seen the work." That shift from defense to reverence wasn't orchestrated. It was earned, slowly through years of showing up, listening, pushing, learning. And now, with one cheap swipe from a privileged voice, that reservoir of respect began to flood the public square. Not because she shouted, because she chose not to. And in that silence, many found themselves reflecting, not just on AOC, but on the state of public discourse, on how easy it is to confuse noise with truth, flash with substance, commentary with contribution. By the end of the week, something rare had happened. People from both sides of the aisle began defending her, not with partisanship, but with a quiet sense of respect, not for her policies, but for her composure. Because sometimes the most unshakable response to mockery isn't defense. It's dignity so deep it becomes untouchable. And that's exactly what her silence had become. It started with a question written in blue marker on a whiteboard in a third-floor classroom at the University of Michigan. Professor Elaine Guerrero, quiet, sharp, known for her no-nonsense teaching style, walked into her Political Science 204 class and asked her students to do something deceptively simple: Define the word qualified. You may use any real-life public figure as your framework. No context, no hint that this was connected to the firestorm still smoldering across every digital platform. Just the prompt. Open-ended, neutral. Almost. The room hushed. Some glanced at each other. Others looked down, their pens hesitating just above the page. Then slowly they began to write. At first the submissions trickled in. Then they surged. Dozens, then hundreds. Professor Guerrero had posted the question publicly, inviting other classes to join. Within hours, students from across the country were submitting essays, voice memos, TikToks, even drawings. None of them mentioned Barron Trump, but one name kept appearing again and again in unexpected places. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. One student wrote about her first time voting, how she had researched every bill AOC had co-sponsored and felt seen for the first time by a government official. Another essay came from a nursing student in Nevada. She wrote that qualified didn't mean perfect, but present, and that AOC was one of the only politicians who showed up in her low-income neighborhood after COVID. A young man from Mississippi described watching AOC question bank executives in committee hearings and realizing she had done more homework than the men she was grilling. But it wasn't just AOC. The answers ranged wide. Mothers, teachers, paramedics, grandparents who'd marched in Selma, veterans who never told their war stories, bus drivers who learned all the kids' names. The pattern was clear. Qualified wasn't about polish. It wasn't about inheritance. It wasn't about looking the part. It was about earning trust in quiet, consistent ways. And somehow, the conversation that had started as a rich kid's smug swipe had been turned, by thousands of students who weren't even trying to go viral, into something larger. That night, Professor Guerrero shared a few of the anonymized responses on her X account. The thread caught fire. Not one celebrity, not one billionaire. These are their role models. This is the America they believe in. Within hours, her thread had over 100,000 retweets. Journalists picked it up. Cable shows debated it. But the students, most of whom had never thought their voices mattered, watched something rare unfold. Their lived experience became evidence. Their definitions began shaping the narrative. And Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, still silent. But that silence now felt deliberate, almost orchestral. Because while pundits were waiting for her to respond to a 12-second insult, something deeper was already answering. The people who had felt seen by her. Not because she said the right things, but because she showed up again and again in places most cameras never bothered to go. This wasn't her statement. This was her legacy reflecting back at her, written in the ink of people who didn't owe her anything, but felt she had earned their respect. And when a student from Georgia posted a screenshot of her paper with the line, "She didn't get there because she looks the part. She got there because she kept showing up, even when people said she didn't belong." Something in the air shifted. This wasn't a defense of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. It was an indictment of every hollow standard that had kept people like her out for so long. And that's when the firestorm stopped being about Barron's remark and started becoming about what America really means when it says someone is qualified. Long before anyone called her AOC, she was just Sandy, a soft-spoken Bronx teenager with a backpack full of notebooks and a heart full of ideas that didn't know how to quit. No TV crews, no headlines, just quiet determination. Mr. Delgado, her high school principal, hadn't thought about that science fair in years, but after the viral midterm essay thread, he dug into his basement and found it. A dusty photo album from 2005. There she was, standing in front of a trifold board, hand-drawn graphs, a handmade water filtration model made out of recycled soda bottles and cotton balls. The title read, "Potable Solutions for Rural Puerto Rico, a Prototype." No glitter, no printed banners, just data, diagrams, evidence, purpose. Mr. Delgado remembered it vividly. All the other entries had parents helping cut foam boards or downloading fancy fonts. But Sandy had stayed after school 3 nights in a row, hunched over library computers, researching reverse osmosis and mapping rainfall in rural Caguas. She'd read about a grandmother in the mountains boiling contaminated water because the local well had dried up. That was what lit her fuse. She didn't come for the ribbon, he posted on Facebook. She came for the people she'd never met but couldn't forget. It was a story nobody had asked for, but in the climate of online noise, it pierced like a quiet arrow through fog. A few hours later, her 11th grade science teacher replied with a single sentence. She wasn't loud. She was precise and relentless, and it resonated, not just because it was about Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, but because it reminded people of someone they knew, a daughter, a niece, the student who stayed late even when no one noticed, the young person who kept asking questions when it would have been easier to stop. The post was screenshotted, shared, quoted on morning shows, but more than that, it triggered a wave. Former teachers, mentors, coaches from other towns, other cities, began sharing memories of students like Sandy, those who didn't look the part but rewrote the part, those who didn't shout to be seen but built things too strong to ignore. And for many older Americans, particularly those over 50, something stirred, because they remembered what it was like to be underestimated, to be told they weren't enough, that they were too brown, too poor, too female, too something. And here was this young woman, now a congresswoman, whose roots didn't just mirror theirs, they vindicated them. Meanwhile, Barron Trump hadn't made another comment, but he didn't need to. The silence had been filled, not by outrage, not by clapbacks, but by a rising flood of stories, receipts, and quiet pride. The contrast was writing itself, and yet none of it had come from AOC's own mouth. It came from the people who saw her long before the world did. And maybe that was the lesson unfolding in real time, that public leadership doesn't begin when the cameras roll. It starts in fluorescent lit classrooms, at kitchen tables with unpaid bills, in forgotten places where young people learn how to fight for others before they're even sure how to fight for themselves. So when a retired union worker from Detroit commented, "She reminded me of my daughter. They told her she wasn't cut out for math. Now she's an engineer." It wasn't just about AOC. It was about every person who had ever been dismissed before they even had a chance to speak. And it left one lingering thought in the minds of millions. If this is what unqualified looks like, then maybe we've been using the wrong measure all along. The noise outside didn't reach his dorm room. Inside the quiet shell of a Georgetown suite, Barron Trump sat cross-legged on his bed, his laptop glowing faintly in the dimness. On screen, dozens of tabs were open. Articles, videos, podcasts. A breadcrumb trail he had followed deeper and deeper since his offhand comment shook the internet. He hadn't meant for it to become a referendum on someone's life, or maybe part of him had. Maybe it felt easy to say what others wouldn't, to speak with the calmness of someone who had never needed to ask for a microphone. But now the silence from AOC wasn't shrinking. It was growing. Not absence, but presence. Not retreat, but resistance by refusal. And it was echoing. He clicked on a YouTube link, not from a news outlet, but a low-resolution podcast interview from 5 years ago. AOC was seated in a modest Bronx community studio, hair tied back, no makeup, just her voice. She was describing her first day in Congress, not the cameras or the oath, but the fear of being seen as an imposter, of sitting in a room filled with people who had worn suits since prep school and wondering whether she belonged. People assume if you come from a struggle, you're not smart, but struggle teaches precision. It teaches strategy, and most of all, it teaches how to listen before you speak. Barron paused. He rewound the clip and played that line again. He thought about his own upbringing, schools with manicured lawns, marble floors, gold-lettered names on the doors. Listening had never been a skill that felt essential. He'd been taught to speak first, to assert, correct, define, never pause. But now something was shifting. He leaned back in his chair and stared at the white ceiling. This wasn't about being right anymore. It wasn't even about politics. It was about something harder, something quieter. Understanding. He scrolled through TikToks people had made, the ones comparing his golfing vacations to AOC handing out food boxes during the pandemic. Others showing her testifying with trembling conviction on the House floor. No anger, just facts. A timeline of labor, of presence, of consistency. He saw comments from people he didn't think would care. Veterans, nurses, students, single mothers, writing not just in her defense, but with a sense of ownership. Like she wasn't a brand to them. She was memory. Proof. His thumb hovered over the screen. Then he closed the apps, opened his notes app, and titled a blank page, "If I Were Honest." He sat there staring at the blinking cursor, not to tweet, not to publish, just to name what was stirring. He thought of the room he'd spoken in, the laughter, the ease. How easy it was to dismiss someone who looked different from his idea of power. But now as the country's pulse shifted, so did his posture. No press statement, no spin. Just a boy, no longer quite so boyish, asking himself the hardest question of all, what am I missing? It was a moment the world would never see, but maybe that's what made it real. And somewhere across the city, a woman who had never replied still hadn't said a word. Because sometimes the loudest echo doesn't come from what's spoken. It comes from what someone chooses not to say. There were no reporters, no podiums, no live streams or sound checks. Just a Wednesday afternoon in a fluorescent-lit classroom on the second floor of a public high school in Queens. The kind with cracked linoleum, rusted lockers, and dreams that never made the morning announcements. She walked in quietly. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez wore no blazer, no heels, just jeans, a worn canvas jacket, and the softness of someone returning home without needing to be noticed. She shook hands with the principal, nodded to a janitor in the hallway, and walked straight into the room where 12 students sat in a loose circle of plastic chairs. They'd been told only that a public servant would be visiting. Most had guessed it would be a borough council member, or maybe someone from the Department of Education. No one expected her, but AOC didn't speak from the front of the room. She sat down with them, level, grounded, like she hadn't just been trending for a week straight. No staffers, no script, just presence. She looked around and smiled, not the performative kind, but the kind that made you feel like you'd been seen before you spoke. I wasn't always the one people believed in, she began slowly. I lost before I ever won, and I was told to smile more before I was asked what I thought. One student, a girl with streaks of pink in her braids, asked if she ever felt like quitting. AOC nodded, no hesitation. I still do. Some days it feels like the louder you speak, the more people try to measure your worth by how quietly you used to walk, or how you look, or how much they assume you don't know. She spoke of her first campaign, the one no one thought she'd win, and no one funded. The nights she handed out flyers outside train stations in the Bronx, being told, "You're cute, but you're not ready." The meetings where men interrupted her mid-sentence just to repeat what she had already said. The donors who looked past her to shake hands with her male volunteers. The exhaustion, the humiliation, the resolve. One boy, eyes low, finally asked, "What made you keep going?" There was a long pause. Then she looked at him, firm but gentle. Because losing in public is painful, but not standing up for yourself? That's a wound that lives in your bones. No one looked at their phones. She shared how her first years in Congress weren't glamorous, how the headlines came before the handshakes, how the spotlight burned but never fed you, and how dignity is something you choose before the world ever agrees you've earned it. At some point, the bell rang. No one moved. She ended not with a speech, but a question. What does power look like to you if you never get a title? The room went still. Some students stared at the floor, others at their shoes. One raised her hand slowly. It looks like you coming here when no one's watching. AOC smiled again, softer this time. She stood up, gave each student a small notebook. Inside on the first page, she'd written the same 5 words. You don't need permission. Ever. Then she left. No photos, no social media, just the quiet sound of 12 pens uncapping, and a legacy quietly planting itself in minds that had only known power from a distance. That day, nothing trended, but something shifted. And not just in that room, because sometimes the most revolutionary thing a leader can do is show up when the cameras don't. It came from the quietest voice in the room. The girl had barely spoken the entire session. She wore her hoodie pulled halfway over her face, eyes down, notebook untouched. But when Alexandria asked if there were any last questions, her hand, almost reluctantly, drifted upward. Her voice cracked, barely louder than a whisper. How do you keep going when people say you're not good enough? The room exhaled. Even the clock on the wall seemed to hesitate before ticking forward. AOC didn't answer right away. She glanced at the girl, then at the other students, all of them suddenly leaning in, like the question had been sitting unspoken in every chest. She leaned forward slightly in her chair. Her tone wasn't fiery, it was low, careful, laced with something deeper than confidence, conviction tempered by bruises. Because I'm not here to convince them, she said slowly. I'm here to serve the ones who already believe in what I do. There was no applause, just stillness. It wasn't a punchline. It wasn't even meant to inspire. It was simply the truth, stripped of performance, polished by experience. Then she added, softer still, but sharper in meaning. If I spent all my energy fighting for space in rooms that never wanted me, I'd have nothing left for the people who need me most. A few students lowered their eyes. One boy looked like he'd just been handed permission to stop begging for validation in places that only offered mirrors, never doors. AOC wasn't lecturing. She was remembering the smirks in campaign halls, the edited headlines, the panelists who called her performative after quoting her words out of context. She had walked into rooms full of people trained to doubt her before she spoke. And yet, she kept showing up, not because she believed she'd be accepted, but because she refused to disappear. You don't have to change who you are to become who they'll respect, she continued. Sometimes the point is never to be acceptable. Sometimes the point is to last long enough to make them catch up. The girl with the hoodie didn't smile, but her eyes rose and they stayed up. AOC let the silence breathe again. She knew its power. In politics, people fill silence to look smart. But in real life, especially in classrooms like this, silence is when things land. She closed her notebook, not because the session was over, but because something had shifted. Her work there was done, not in what she said, but in how she made them feel. The bell rang again. Still, no one moved. Before leaving, AOC turned to the students one last time. Her voice didn't lift. It deepened. Don't spend your youth auditioning for people who can't see your worth. Use it. Burn it. Build something that makes their opinion irrelevant. And just like that, she was gone. The hallway filled with footsteps, backpacks zipped, doors opened. But inside that classroom, the girl in the hoodie reached for her pen. She didn't know what she would write, but for the first time in a long time, she believed it would be worth reading. It wasn't planned. The teacher didn't even think the camera had caught anything meaningful. It was shaky, shot from the corner of a cluttered classroom, with students half listening, scribbling in notebooks or scrolling their phones. Alexandria was standing by the chalkboard, no mic, no stage, just a black marker and a tired wall behind her. She'd been talking for nearly 40 minutes, no flashy quotes, no slogan-ready moments. But then, just before the bell, she paused. The teacher, reviewing footage that evening, almost skipped over the last minute. But something in AOC's stillness made her lean closer. You don't need to be loud to lead, Alexandria had said. You need to show up, again and again, even when no one claps, even when they say you're too emotional, too brown, too idealistic. Especially then, the students were quiet in the clip. Not because they were bored, because something had settled. The teacher clipped just that final 60 seconds. No transitions, no caption, just the raw words. And she posted it with a simple title, The Day My Students Finally Listened. By midnight, the video had 800,000 views. By morning, it was everywhere. People weren't sharing it for political points. They were sharing it like a mirror, passing it to daughters, students, colleagues themselves. Something about the delivery, not rehearsed, not rhetorical, made it feel earned. One tweet read, "Not all leaders speak to rooms full of cameras. Some speak to rooms full of silence and still change everything." Meanwhile, in a dorm room 2 states away, Barron Trump couldn't sleep. he hadn't intended to watch. The algorithm had slipped the clip between golf tutorials and foreign policy debates, but the title caught him just enough to tap. He watched the whole minute, twice. Then he reached for his phone, pulled up his notes, the ones he'd been drafting privately since the Georgetown panel, and quietly started deleting, one by one. Lines that sounded clever but didn't feel honest. Jabs dressed as insights. The paragraph where he tried to spin his comment as a critique of branding in modern politics. He erased them all, and then he just stared at the screen. Blank. No words, no backup plan, but also no urge to defend himself. He didn't repost the clip. He didn't tweet. He didn't message anyone about it, but he saved it. Not in a folder marked research or media, just saved it, alone. That night, the teacher's comment section flooded with stories, people who had almost quit something they cared about, until that clip reminded them why they started. A nurse from Chicago wrote, "I watched this at 3 a.m. during my break. It made me cry. Not because she was right, but because she wasn't trying to prove it." Underneath that, a quiet comment stood out. No username, just a string of numbers. Leadership isn't volume, it's presence. It didn't go viral. It didn't need to, because the ones who understood didn't scroll past. They stayed. Barron didn't expect the email. It was short. Director, no emotion. "Barron, if you're available, I'd like to speak with you briefly. No pressure. Office hours, 2 to 4 p.m. Professor Kessler." He stared at it for 10 minutes before responding with a single word. "Sure." By the time he arrived, the hallway was already empty. Most students had gone home. The door to her office was open. No formal knock needed. She looked up, offered a nod, and gestured to the seat across from her. No printed article in hand. No laptop. Just a half-finished mug of tea and a legal pad with a single line scribbled across the top. "What we say when we think no one will remember." He sat. There was no scolding. No grand lecture. She didn't raise her voice, or even change her tone. She simply asked the kind of question that didn't need to be sharp to cut. "What work did you do before making that statement?" Silence. Barron blinked. Once, twice. She didn't press. Just sat there, letting the air settle like snow. I've followed her career, in a surface way," he said finally. "I've watched clips, read articles, the usual." Professor Kessler tilted her head gently. "And did you do any work to understand the ground she stands on?" Barron's throat tightened. "You mean her positions?" "No," she said quietly. "I mean her process, her path, her public silences, her private fights." Barron looked down at his hands. He realized for the first time he didn't actually know what AOC had studied in college. He didn't know what books shaped her, or what losses taught her more than wins. He just assumed. The professor leaned back in her chair. "We're in an age where criticism is cheap and access is infinite. So I ask my students, if your opinion takes 10 seconds to form, it might not be your opinion. It might just be your inheritance." Barron's face flushed. "I didn't mean for it to be arrogant." Kessler smiled, not unkindly. "Barron, arrogance isn't about volume. It's about skipping the homework." A long pause followed. Barron had no defense, only a growing awareness that he had confused cleverness for clarity, that he had spoken in a tone shaped more by legacy than learning, that his comment, however offhand, had landed in a world hungry for depth and suspicious of shortcuts. Professor Kessler reached for her mug and took a slow sip, then set it down. "You're not in trouble, but you are at a fork. One road leads to performance, the other to responsibility. You have to choose which one you're rehearsing." He nodded slowly. Words felt too small to carry what he was feeling. As he stood to leave, she offered one final sentence, almost as a passing breeze, but it stayed with him like thunder. "Next time you speak about someone's substance, make sure you've tasted the weight of theirs." Outside her office, the hallway lights flickered to life. It was late afternoon now. The campus was hushed, like it knew something had just shifted. Barron walked back to his dorm slower than usual. That night, he didn't open social media. He opened his laptop, title, "If I Were Honest." And this time, he didn't write to prove a point. He wrote to start over. Barron didn't sleep that night. He just wrote. By morning, he had 10 messy paragraphs in a Google Doc that wasn't meant for eyes other than his own. Lines crossed out, sentences rewritten 3-4 times. Words like entitlement and blind spots showed up. Not because he was trying to impress, but because he was finally naming things. Then the phone rang. His father's voice came through first. Familiar, sharp, trained by decades of battles and sound bites. Listen, don't apologize, not even a hint of it. They'll eat you alive. The second you show weakness, you're not correcting, you're surrendering. Barron opened his mouth, then closed it. It was always like this. Answers before questions, instructions before introspection. This isn't about them, Barron said quietly. It's about what I didn't see. No, it's always about them, his father snapped. The minute you think it's about your growth, they'll turn it into your guilt, and they will not forgive you for it. Click. 2 hours later, his mother called. Her tone was softer, but carried its own kind of chill. The tone of someone who'd spent her entire adult life balancing grace with scrutiny. Stay above it, Barron. Let the noise pass. These moments are traps. You'll say something with good intentions, and they'll spin it until it bruises. Barron leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. But what if I meant it this time? There was a pause on the line, longer than expected. Meaning well isn't protection, she said gently. In our world, sometimes dignity means silence. Barron didn't answer, because he didn't know yet whether silence in his case was maturity or just fear with a better outfit. It wasn't until evening that he met with someone who didn't share his last name. Professor Kessler had recommended him to an alum, a quiet giant in policy circles named Evan Ortega, former community organizer, now a rising voice in urban justice reform, the kind of man who shook hands without checking for cameras. They met at a coffee shop 3 blocks from campus. No press, no handlers, just 2 chairs and the smell of burnt espresso. Barron didn't try to impress him. He just handed over the printed draft of his note and said, I don't know what to do with this. Ortega read it once, then again, slower. He didn't smile, didn't nod, just sat with it like it was a fire he didn't want to blow on too soon. Finally, he looked up. You don't have to back down, he said, but if you're willing to lean in, to the discomfort, to the work, that's the only direction worth walking. Barron tilted his head, cautious. But does leaning in mean apologizing? Ortega shook his head. No, it means stepping forward, knowing why you're there, not reacting, responding, owning the gap between who you were and who you're trying to become. Barron looked out the window. The streetlights were starting to flicker on. He didn't feel certain, but he felt clear. What if they don't believe me? Ortega gave a half smile. Then you let your next 10 years say what your last 10 seconds couldn't. That night, Barron didn't open Twitter. He didn't check headlines. He just pulled open that old Google Doc, gave it a title, Draft 1, not a statement, a start, and began again. This time not to fix his image, but to find his footing. Barron opened his laptop again. Blank document. Just a blinking cursor and the pressure of 1,000 eyes that hadn't even seen what he'd write yet. He typed, I want to apologize if... Pause. His fingers hovered. Backspace. He tried again. What I said wasn't meant to... Stop. He exhaled sharply, frustrated at how every sentence felt like it was about him, his feelings, his fallout, his future. It all felt performative, packaged, like a PR memo, not a reckoning. He slammed the laptop shut. For 20 minutes, he just sat. Then, almost by instinct, he opened YouTube and typed in her name. He wasn't sure what he was looking for. Maybe a speech to dissect. Maybe a clip to feel angry at again. What came up first surprised him. A raw, shaky phone recording of AOC at a protest near a detention center. No polished backdrop, no notes in her hand. She wasn't speaking. She was just there, standing beside a mother whose child had been taken. Barron leaned in. The clip showed her kneel. She put a hand on the woman's shoulder, listened, and when the woman cried, AOC didn't say a word. She cried with her. No sound bites, no outrage theater, just presence. He found another clip, this one older, buried in a thread of activist archives. It was AOC in a back hallway, hair pulled back, eyes red after a long day of field hearings in Texas. A reporter asked, "Do you feel like your efforts are making any difference?" She didn't snap. She didn't answer right away. She looked at the floor, then said quietly, "Some people keep score with polls. I keep score with dignity." Barron paused the video. He realized something brutal and clear. She never mentioned me, not once. Not in the firestorm. Not when she could have clapped back. Not even when she had every moral high ground to strike. She didn't have to mention him because he was never the point. This wasn't about what he said. It was about the weight people like her carried. The weight no apology could reduce, and no sentence could truly address. It hit him hard. Maybe the most dangerous thing he'd done wasn't the words. It was assuming the story had anything to do with him. He reopened the laptop, pulled up the draft again, stared at the half-finished sentence. This time he didn't delete it. He just let it be unfinished. Sometimes silence said more than 100 clever pivots. He grabbed his phone. No Twitter this time. No Notes app manifesto. Just one text. To the only person who wouldn't weaponize his next move. "Can I send you something? I think I'm ready." Sent to Professor Kessler. Then he placed the phone screen down. For the first time in weeks, he didn't feel hunted by headlines or haunted by clips. He felt still. And maybe for the first time since all of this started, he wasn't trying to win. San Antonio was scorching that day. But inside the Youth Leadership Conference Hall, the temperature wasn't what made the air feel heavy. It was anticipation. Every chair filled, every phone tilted upward, every young person waiting to be seen. AOC had been invited to talk about economic equity. That was the official theme. Her team had crafted a polished speech. Stats, citations, federal programs, sliding scale tax reforms, all stacked neatly in the binder she carried on stage. She spoke for 10 minutes, steady and composed. And then she paused. She looked at the room, not over it, not past it, into it. She put her notes down. Her hand rested gently on the edge of the podium. She didn't grip it like a shield. She released it like a burden. And then, in a voice no louder than necessary, she said, "You already know what the numbers are. But I want to talk about something that never gets printed in economic reports." The crowd, half Gen Z, half millennials, froze, as if sensing that what was coming wouldn't be a soundbite, but a turning point. "I want to talk about being underestimated." The room leaned in. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't rage. But somehow, every word landed like thunder in soft cloth. Being told you're too young, too brown, too loud, too quiet, too emotional, too ambitious, too complicated. Being told you're not ready, that you should wait your turn, while someone else cashes in on the very problems you're dying to solve. There was no applause, not yet. She wasn't building up to a cheer. She was building truth. "I was told all of that. I still am. And yet here I am. Not because I beat the system, but because I refused to believe the lie that I wasn't already enough to begin." A hand went up, not from the press section, but from a girl in the fifth row. No script, just instinct. "How do you keep going when they keep talking down to you?" AOC smiled. Not a smile for cameras, a smile that knew the weight behind that question. She answered slowly, "Because I remember who I'm doing this for. Not them. You." Now the applause came, not like a performance, but like pressure finally released. She continued, "There's a story in the headlines right now that's not about me, but about how this country reacts when someone like me doesn't clap back, when I choose to stay silent, and it's driving people wild. Because silence, for women like us, for people like us, is never neutral. It's defiance. It's power." She took a beat. "You think your strength is in proving people wrong, but sometimes the real strength is not needing to." That was when the teacher in the back, who had brought 20 students in a borrowed van, whispered to herself, This is the real civics lesson." Later, a clip of her speech, not the prepared one, But the improvised moment would go viral. Not because it was fiery, but because it was clear. It didn't sound like Congress. It sounded like conviction. And in one particular dorm room, miles away, a young man named Barron watched the video silently. He didn't comment. He didn't share it, but he replayed it. Twice. Then he closed his laptop, opened a blank document again, not to perform, not to posture, but to write like someone who finally realized that listening was part of leadership too. The girl in the front row wore a white t-shirt with a single bold word printed across the chest. Unapologetic. No period, no decoration, just a statement, unfiltered, unapologetic, exactly how AOC stepped up to the podium for the second time that afternoon. No permission, no apology. There were no more notes in her hands. No carefully prepared bullet points about federal budgets or tax reforms. Instead, there was a deep breath and a very AOC decision to speak from her gut, not her script. I've been called loud, pretty, dangerous, angry, she began, her eyes meeting the eager stares of young people craving something more real than the headlines and more human than the hashtags. But never by those who watched me work a double shift and draft legislation at 2 a.m. That line didn't land like applause bait. It landed like a hammer, shattering the mask so many women have been forced to wear just to be seen as professional. They say I should soften my tone to be more likable. I tell them this: I didn't come here to fit your comfort. I came here to shake the memory of those who forgot their own power. The room went quiet, not with fear, but with reflection. Everyone in the audience seemed to ask themselves the same question. When was the last time I shrank myself just to be tolerated? And why did I accept that as normal? A girl from Atlanta raised her hand, hesitant. How do you know when to speak up and when to stay quiet so people don't see you as too much? AOC nodded, then stepped away from the podium and sat on its edge, leveling herself with the girl. When you speak, she said, make sure it's something you believe down to your bones. And when you're silent, make sure it's not out of fear, but out of strategy. Sometimes silence isn't weakness. It's waiting for your moment to land louder. At the back of the room, a teacher turned her phone camera, not on AOC, but on her student's face. The girl's eyes were lit up, not with fandom, but with recognition, like she'd just been seen, really seen for the first time. Then AOC closed, not with applause lines, but with a challenge. Don't lower your voice to fit their comfort. Raise your work to meet your own standard. No one moved for 3 full seconds. Then came the applause. Not the usual clapping for performance, but the kind that happens when a room full of people realize something in them just changed. That night, the clip made the rounds online with a simple caption. She didn't just speak. She gave us permission. And in a room hundreds of miles away on the East Coast, Barron watched the clip. Not out of curiosity, but because he needed to hear something school never quite taught him. Growing up isn't about being right. It's about being ready to change. He opened the old draft he'd never finished. This time, he didn't edit the words, he edited the tone. From defensive to humble. She stood at the center of the stage with no microphone in hand now. Just the weight of every name they tried to twist into a headline, every insult they had weaponized into distraction. But she wasn't there to defend herself anymore. She had outgrown that version of the fight. Her final words came not as an exclamation, but as an affirmation. Calm, grounded, devastatingly clear. They said I was unqualified, that I didn't belong in these rooms, that I should wait my turn. A pause, her voice didn't rise, but it didn't have to. But the people I fight for, they've never needed convincing. The silence that followed was not empty. It was electric. The kind of silence that forms when people realize they've just been handed a mirror they didn't ask for, but couldn't look away from. And then the applause came. Not polite, not routine, but urgent, physical, like the room needed to rise to match her, to meet the height of what had just been said. There were students who didn't clap at first, not because they weren't moved, but because they were still processing, because something had just cracked inside them. Not broken, opened. A woman in the third row clenched her jaw so tightly it trembled. A young man near the aisle wiped away tears without embarrassment. A professor, arms crossed at the back, uncrossed them slowly, as if letting go of something he'd held too long. The applause became a kind of release. People stood not because everyone else was, but because sitting felt like dishonesty, because standing was the only thing their bodies knew how to do in that moment. Outside the auditorium, someone posted the full video. No edits, no captions, just the truth as it landed. In the first 2 hours, it reached 500,000 views. By the next morning, it passed 4 million. At hour 48, it hit 10 million. And the comments weren't the usual fire emoji parade or tired debates. They were quieter, more raw. I needed this more than I realized. I showed this to my daughter. She's 12. She cried. Then she asked me how to run for student council. This made me rethink everything I've accepted just to be included. And deep in that sea of comments, buried beneath the trending hashtags and screenshot quotes, was a single one that simply said, "Thank you for not shrinking." It didn't have a name, no profile photo, just a flicker of someone, somewhere, who had been holding their breath for years and finally exhaled. And even though AOC didn't reply, she read it. She read all of it, not out of ego, but because she needed the reminder too. Because in a world that still calls her too much, too Latina, too loud, too radical, too young, she needed to remember the one truth that had always carried her. She wasn't built to be accepted. She was built to wake people up. And this time, they stayed awake. He didn't call a press conference. He didn't sit for a glossy interview. There was no entourage, no PR firm polishing the words. Just one slide, white background, black text, no logo, no signature, no ego. I made a flippant comment about a woman I didn't understand. That's on me. She did the work. I hadn't. I'm listening now. It dropped at 7:03 a.m. No taglines, no hashtags, just truth. The kind that doesn't ask for forgiveness, but offers something harder. Responsibility. At first, the reaction was disbelief. Some thought it was fake. Others said his account must have been hacked. In an internet built on denial, deflection, and drama, it read like an act of rebellion, a young man from power admitting he'd been wrong, and not just wrong, lazy. The silence that followed was louder than any trending topic, because everyone knew what he was referring to. That comment, the one he made 2 weeks ago, offhandedly, like so many had before him, about that woman who talks too fast and thinks too much of herself. He'd said it with a smirk, on a podcast, with millions of listeners. And yet what followed wasn't another spiral of clapbacks and dunk tweets. It was something else, something rarer. He had watched the San Antonio clip, the one with the standing ovation, the quiet tears, the raw comments from strangers who saw themselves in her story. He had watched it not once but twice, then alone, then with his younger sister. Then again at 3 a.m., when he couldn't sleep and realized that for all the books he'd read, he had never studied a woman like her. A woman who didn't seek to be tolerated, but to be fully heard. And that's what changed him. Not the backlash, not the headlines, not the political damage. It was that feeling, unfamiliar and uncomfortable, of being confronted with substance where he expected spectacle, of realizing she hadn't raised her voice at him. She had raised her standard, and he was nowhere near it. His post spread like wildfire, but not the usual kind. Not rage viral, not scandal-fueled. It moved differently, quietly, intimately. This felt like a note my own brother could have written. Growth looks good on people, especially those raised never to show it. It's not weak to admit when you've underestimated someone. It's honest. And in a world that so often rewards the last word, Barron Trump had done something unexpected. He stopped talking and started reflecting. He didn't ask to be praised. He didn't pivot to himself. He redirected the spotlight. Back to her, back to the work. Back to the part of the story most people skipped, the labor. Because if there's one thing power rarely teaches its heirs, it's how to shut up and learn. But that morning on millions of timelines, a new story began. Not because he got everything right, but because, for once, he didn't try to rewrite what had already happened. He chose to sit with it, publicly, uncomfortably, and let the world see a version of him that hadn't yet arrived but just might. And in that silence, that slide, that 7-line post, you could almost hear a generation exhale. She didn't retweet, didn't quote, like, or even drop a vague emoji. No passive-aggressive posts, no strategic silence dripping with implication. Nothing. While every pundit and podcast host dissected Barron Trump's unexpected apology, waiting for her next move like it was a chessboard, AOC simply moved on. A week later, she was already 3 cities into a listening tour. Not the performative kind, but the kind with folding chairs, bad coffee, and real people asking questions without pre-approval. It happened at a library-turned-town hall in Akron. The room was full but hushed, as if people knew they were watching something that hadn't been prepackaged. Near the end of the night, a high school girl with thick braids and a sweatshirt that said "unapologetic" stood up. Her voice trembled, not from fear, but from the weight of trying to say something that mattered. "Do you forgive people who dismiss you?" she asked. AOC didn't blink, didn't flinch. Just smiled, not wide but warm, like someone who had already thought this through long before it was asked. "Growth doesn't offend me," she said. "In fact, I expect it." The room paused. You could feel it, that low hum of minds turning inward. Because she wasn't just talking about Barron. She was talking about every teacher who told a girl like her to talk less. Every employer who called assertiveness a bad attitude. Every voice that once said, "You don't belong here," and now suddenly wants a seat at your table. She wasn't dragging anyone. She wasn't absolving either. What she did was harder. She reframed. "I don't keep a ledger," she continued. "People aren't debts to be collected or dismissed. They're stories, and some take longer to tell than others." There was no applause line, but there was a shift in the room, subtle but seismic, the kind that doesn't trend but transforms. What hit people wasn't just the words, it was the refusal to become what they expected. No bitterness, no fake magnanimity, just clarity, strength without spectacle, a boundary, not a blade. And in a world that demands constant reaction, her restraint became its own form of rebellion. Because let's be honest, she could have destroyed him. She had the receipts, the sharpness, the entire internet behind her. But she knew something most people in power forget. It's easy to win arguments. Much harder to elevate the conversation. By not responding, she responded louder. That clip, grainy, unpolished, filmed on a teenager's phone, racked up millions of views within days. But what people shared wasn't just the moment, it was what it meant. She turned a question into a compass. "This made me rethink how I react to people changing. I want to raise my daughter like this." And for every person waiting for her to clap back, what they got instead was a masterclass in power. The kind that doesn't shout to be heard, but listens long enough to understand where to speak. She wasn't trying to own the moment. She was showing what ownership actually looks like, of self, of history, of the space between harm and healing. That night, the girl in the unapologetic sweatshirt posted a selfie with AOC. The caption was simple. "She didn't tell me what to forgive. She showed me how to grow." No mic drop, no moral of the story neatly tied up in a bow. Just a subtle pivot that said, the story is still being written, and we all get to decide what kind of characters we want to be in it. Weeks after that Akron town hall, something unexpected started happening in classrooms. Not just in progressive enclaves or big city prep schools, but in small towns. Charter schools, even correctional education programs. Teachers began handing out printouts of Barron's note and AOC's town hall response side by side, stapled together under the heading, "Case Study, What Work Means." Students were asked to write essays, but not just about apologies, about process, about what it takes to sit with discomfort, to change your mind, and then stay changed. Some titled their essays, "Silence Isn't Neutral," or "Accountability Looks Like This." But one title kept showing up again and again, "Do the Work." Somewhere quieter, off camera, unannounced, Barron Trump was spotted sitting in the back row of a civic seminar in D.C. No press, no aides, just a composition notebook and a pen. Not trying to speak, just listening. AOC didn't post about it. She didn't shade him. But a week later, she walked into a different room, a quiet space in a local high school where she was scheduled to speak to a class on civic ethics. At the front of the room, taped to the edge of a desk, was a yellow sticky note. Sharpied in block letters, it read, "Do the work." She paused, smiled barely, and then began. Because the truth is, legacy isn't in the sound bites. It's not in the shout or the spectacle. It's in the stillness, in what people choose to carry with them when the moment is over. And the final line, the one she never tweeted but always lived. You don't earn your voice by speaking first. You earn it by being the one who still shows up when the applause is gone. What if the loudest mic drop wasn't a shout, but a choice to stay silent? This story flipped the script. A powerful woman chose grace over revenge. A young man chose growth over ego. And in that quiet space, millions saw what true courage looks like. Showing up, doing the work, and letting your actions outlive your noise. It made me ask myself, am I really listening when it counts, or just waiting to speak? Now I ask you, have you ever misjudged someone only to realize they were the teacher you didn't know you needed? In the end, legacy isn't what we post. It's what sticks when the screen goes dark. Let's be the ones who still show up when the applause is gone. If this made you feel something, share it. Comment your do the work moment. And don't forget to subscribe for what's coming next. Because this conversation is just getting started. Hashtag do the work. Hashtag legacy in the listening. Hashtag mix still on. If this story touched you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to Alexandria Rising Stories, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching Alexandria Rising Stories.